And do you always take his no as a final no, Mrs. Reagan?
Yes, although I may come back to it a little bit later and try again.
You've seen that when she'll fall back 5 steps and then try again?
Come in from a different direction. Yeah.
That was Ronald and Nancy Reagan back in 1985 at the start of the 40th president's second term in office. And while Nancy laughed when asked about her influence on the president, our next guest writes about the times the late First Lady had to step in to help the administration. Joining us now is columnist for the Washington Post, Karen Tumulty. She's the author of the new book out today entitled The Triumph of Nancy Reagan.
So, Karen, you are a very courageous writer. The mere name, Nancy Reagan, triggers people. It's just like I saw a documentary that blamed Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan for everything from the trading of Mookie Betts to L.A. to chicken weed in people's bag. I mean, everything. They're triggered. So I've been seeing people going after you on Twitter, and you're like, you really should, if not read the book, at least read a little of the history. But I remember after Reagan got elected, I mean, Nancy Reagan was turned into a one-dimensional character by her critics from the start. Why?
That's right. And thank you so much for having me on. She was really complicated. And, quite frankly, I don't think she really wanted people to understand her. But she was really portrayed as this kind of traditional pre-feminist throwback. And she brought a lot of her problems on herself, buying expensive china, redecorating the White House in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression. I don't flinch from any of that in the book. But she was just an essential partner to Ronald Reagan, in part because what people don't really understand about Reagan is that as affable as he was, as genial as he was, as gifted as he was at connecting with the American public, he was really a solitary figure. He liked people. He didn't need them. He was close to exactly one person in the world, and he married her. And it was Nancy Reagan who really takes on the sort of tougher parts of politics, the interpersonal conflict, when somebody had to go because they weren't serving her husband well, she was usually the one to know it first and the one to make it happen. As James Baker told me, her political instincts were actually better than her husband's.
Well, and she wasn't afraid, even though she seemed demure on the camera when asked. She wasn't afraid to stay on him. I remember back when Don Regan got fired, and Nancy staying after him so much that what Reagan yelled back at her about getting off his back in a bit of a harsher terminology actually made the papers back then, which was a rarity. But Nancy had her way, and Don Regan left.
And she also, the people in her husband's orbit who were smart enough to know made her their ally. Certainly James Baker did, George Shultz did. And, one of the things that she wanted to see was she wanted to see her husband go down in history as a peacemaker, not a warmonger. She understood that it was possible, that along with his Cold War rhetoric, his anti-communist posture, there was an idealist, and that he believed in a world without nuclear weapons. And he also believed in his own abilities as a negotiator. This was something that, a lot of the people, the hawkish people on his security team resisted. They thought there could never be a working relationship with Moscow. But she sets it up so that George Shultz gets the president alone one night. And that is the moment where Shultz begins to realize this guy is dying to have an opening with Moscow. He also realizes, as George Shultz told me, anybody with any brains would make a friend of the First Lady.
Yeah, there's a moment in here where right after Ronald Reagan gave his Evil Empire speech, there's a moment here where you describe how Nancy Reagan is just leaning in on him and berating him for using such intemperate language. Stu Spencer, of course, a longtime aide, is there. And so Reagan turns and asks Stu Spencer if he agrees with Nancy, and he begins to answer and is cut off by Ronald Reagan because Reagan saw that Stu Spencer, too, was going to say, yes, sir, an evil empire, but your language was intemperate. And you have that wonderful Gromyko moment. Explain that to our viewers, if you will.
Well, Gromyko was the Soviet foreign minister, really tough character, known as Grim Grom or Mr. Niet. And he is invited to the White House, and he is the highest Soviet official to that date ever received in the Reagan White House. And so Shultz tells Nancy, he says, why don't you come around for the reception? So Gromyko sees her in there immediately. She starts flirting with him because she was a world-class flirt. And at some point, Gromyko says, why is it so hard to get your husband to the negotiating table? Why don't you whisper peace in his ear at night? And Nancy Reagan grabs him by his shoulders and sort of pulls him down. And she says, I will, and I'll whisper it in your ear too, peace. And he's just completely taken aback. And afterward, George Shultz tells Nancy, you just won the Cold War, Nancy. But she also steps in at the moments when her husband's presidency is in its greatest peril. And I really think the heart of the book is the Iran-Contra scandal, where Nancy Reagan quite literally runs the rescue effort, including shaking up the White House staff, getting Don Regan fired, but also convincing her husband, her very stubborn husband, that he is going to have to admit to the country and admit to himself that he has traded arms to Iran in exchange for the release of U.S. hostages, something that he had promised he would never do and something that was against policy. And sort of how she does that and the people she literally sneaks people in through a semi-secret tunnel between the Treasury building and the East Wing to come up and make the case to her husband, the eternal optimist, you are in some serious trouble here, potentially legal trouble, and you're going to have to make an admission that you don't want to make.
Yeah, and as you write in the book, not the only time when Nancy Reagan saw the danger her husband was in more than he saw it, handpicked the speechwriter for that speech and convinced him, as you say, to admit to a mistake. There's another fascinating piece of the book. Obviously, President Reagan, the Reagan administration, has been criticized for ignoring for too long the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. And it was Nancy Reagan who finally nudged him with a little help from Liz Taylor to confront the crisis.
Yeah, this is not to excuse anything. The complacency, the neglect of the Reagan administration to the AIDS epidemic will go down and will remain one of the deepest scars on its legacy. But once again, Nancy Reagan, before her husband gets a sense of what is going on, she and her husband and her son, Ron, start trying to sort of talk to Reagan about this, get him to understand what is going on. And finally, he decides, belatedly, that he is going to finally, in 1987, give a speech on this. And at that point, the conservatives in the White House don't see AIDS as a health crisis. They see it as a moral crisis, as an assault on, because they believe homosexuality is a sin and an assault on nature. Pat Buchanan at one point was the White House communications director, and he said, oh, the poor homosexuals, they sinned against nature, and now nature is striking back. So Nancy not only gets him to give the speech, she won't let the West Wing touch the speech. She goes out, gets her own speechwriter, Landon Parvin, for the first time, the president actually sits down with his Surgeon General, Everett Koop, to discuss this. Now, by then, the conservatives in the White House have figured out what's going on, and they are sort of waging a counter assault. And I really, just going through the speech writing records in the Reagan Library on all of this was just a revelation of the battles that were going on inside the White House and even inside the Reagan family over this.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.